any money or government or private property. That makes sense. It's a primitive tribe, but there are tribes like that. But if an anthropologist came back and said, in my tribe, they have an elaborate system of money, private property, government, marriage, but no language. None at all. We know that can't be right. You got to have a language, and we can now state why. All of human institutional reality presupposes language in a way that language does not presuppose other forms of institutional reality. Why not? What gives you the power to create a speech act just with the mastery of the syntax and the semantics of a language is meaning. See, if I utter the sentence, snow is white, then I have created a new fact, namely I've made the statement that snow is white. But that was done solely in virtue of meaning. The meaning of the sentence guarantees my ability to create a speech act by uttering that sentence meaningfully. But when I create an institutional reality, I use a semantics to create powers that go beyond the semantics. See, when I say, this is the President of the United States, this is money, I'm again using semantics, but it's quite different from saying snow is white, because in those cases, I am assigning a status function to something that does not have that status function in virtue of its physical structure. So language is the fundamental social institution, and it functions differently from other social institutions. In the case of language, the meaning of the sentence is sufficient to give you the power to perform a speech act with that sentence. But once you have sentences, you can then use the semantic powers of the sentence to create powers that go beyond the semantic powers. Barack Obama was created as president by semantic powers. He was sworn in and pronounced as president by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But the powers that then accrue to him go beyond semantic powers. So in the case of institutional reality, we create institutional powers that go beyond semantic powers. We use semantics to create powers that go beyond semantics. But in the case of language itself, where we're just making assertions, for example, the powers do not go beyond semantics. We use meaning to create speech acts, but the speech act has no power beyond itself. Whereas in institutional reality, we use meaning to create a reality that goes beyond language itself. Okay, now I'm supposed to stop by 11:30, right? So we're almost there. Let me mention a couple points where this leads to other forms of investigation. I think our whole tradition of political and social philosophy is unbelievably superficial, going back to Aristotle. And the reasons are very simple. They all take language for granted. See, the worst offenders are the social contract theorists. The social contract theorists thought, we're all running around in the woods talking to each other, and then some genius said, fellas, let's get together and make a social contract. And then they made a social contract, and there are various debates about this. On the theory that I have been presenting you, you can't take language for granted. Once you've got language, you've already got a social contract. Once you've got language, you've got the possibility of status function declarations. And that means there are, as far as I'm concerned, there are no language-speaking societies that do not have institutional facts, because the language, a human language, is going to contain the possibility of status function declarations. And there are these wonderful languages that are very primitive. Anthropologists are not allowed to say primitive, but they are primitive. I'm not an anthropologist, so I can say that. And they have not yet used status functions to create, they have not yet used language to create very many elaborate status functions, but they already have some. They have rights and duties and obligations that are built in to the very possibility of using a language that has the double direction of fit. So I think if I'm right about this, and I'm fairly confident that I've finally got it right, it took me a long time, this should give us a new way to think the nature of social and political theory, which is unbelievably superficial. I can't believe these guys got away with it. But the reason it's superficial is they never asked the question, what is language? They took language for granted. If I'm right about that, and I'm pretty confident I am, then it seems to me it opens up a whole lot of other areas of investigation. Think of human rights. Now, human rights is one of these great, like corporations, one of these great ingenious human creations. I think it's a creation of the Enlightenment. I can't really find it before then. And I'm not quite sure. I don't know who was the first person to get the idea that just in virtue of being a human being, you had rights. That human was a Y term. That the Y term equals human, and that automatically gave you the status function of rights. You see, before then, before the European Enlightenment, the Y term here, I keep running out of juice anyway, it doesn't matter. The Y term is just being human, and that gives you rights. Just being a human gives you rights that go with the status human. See, before that you had rights as a lord of the manor, or even serfs had rights. There were rights that were assigned in virtue of your position in society. But this said, it doesn't matter what your position is, just being a human gives you rights. And then the question is, well, how do we justify those? And I think that's an interesting intellectual question. And I offer an answer to that in a book I wrote fairly recently, which I won't go into detail about the answer. But the idea is, once you recognize that human rights are status functions, then you're in a position to answer the question, which status function should we assign to people just in virtue of being human, and what's the justification for these rights as opposed to others? Now, another set of questions that seems to me is opened up here is the nature of political power as opposed to, for example, police power or military power. There's no clear distinction, obviously, they're interacting. But I want to say there's a natural sense in which political systems require acceptance of the system of status function. Otherwise, you just have a concentration camp or a system under military occupation, and that often happens, especially in Europe. But the distinction between political power and, let's say, military power is that political power is a system of status functions, and it only works to the extent that it's accepted, and then you have these marvelous changes. We ought to have a much better understanding of what happened in North Africa last year, the Arab Spring, a stunning collapse of systems of status functions. Or I don't have to tell you the best of all, Annus Mirabilis, 1989, when the whole damn system collapsed. I was driving home and I heard on the radio people were coming over the wall. I couldn't believe it. I went home and turned on the television. I've been through that wall many times at Checkpoint, several times, at Checkpoint Charlie. The most depressing thing in the world was the communist regime. If you went to East Germany, and I think East Germany was probably worse than the people with the CSR, what was it called? Well, anyway, the Czech Soviet Republic. East Germany was probably worse, but they were both awful. And when the people came over the wall, I knew it's over. I mean, I didn't have the jargon then, but the system of status functions has collapsed. Because if you can come over that wall, we've won. With our idiot leaders and our muddled version of capitalism and our incompetent political system, we've defeated the most powerful totalitarian organization in history, the Soviet Empire. It's over. And the system of status functions came down with astonishing rapidity. Anyway, it's interesting to study historical changes like this, because one of the marvelous things about that was unpredicted. Nobody, people will tell you now, well, I knew all along that the Soviet Union was going to collapse at any moment. And I've had wonderful arguments with people in the Reagan administration. See, they had a theory. The theory was, if we're armed to the teeth, they will be forced to negotiate because they can't keep up with us. They can't afford it. What happened was, we armed to the teeth and they collapsed. They went bankrupt. That's right. They couldn't afford it. They simply collapsed. Now, history is going to be rewritten. I've told this to people who worked in the Reagan administration, they said, we knew all along. We knew all along that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Well, I don't believe it. I don't think anybody